And let's begin with details coming in of the Supreme Court's judgment verdict on the Bulldozer justice model. The Supreme Court, in its scathing judgment, has said that the house of any accused, or for that matter any convict, cannot be demolished in the manner that is being done by the executive. The Supreme Court saying even convicts have legal safeguards, and that if you target someone's property, their home or their commercial property, it's a breach of their fundamental right. The Supreme Court saying that even in the case of death sentences, it's upon the court to decide the punishment, not on the executive, and that's why this kind of bulldozer model of justice is simply unacceptable. The top court in its judgment has said that you cannot take away life and property arbitrarily, and that this is a clear abuse of power and erosion of law. The Supreme Court, therefore, in its judgment, has said that officials who are responsible for this high-handedness must face action. The Supreme Court has spoken also of providing compensation to anyone who's faced this kind of bulldozer justice. I want to bring in Kanu Sarda, who tracks the courts for us very, very closely. Kanu, get us some of the highlights of what the Supreme Court has said. Look, in their verdict, they've made it very clear that the state is accountable for this kind of bulldozer justice. But have they also spoken about what needs to be done? What kind of a crackdown perhaps we could see, or what the victims here of bulldozer justice will get?
Yes, Akshita, we will see a kind of guidelines which will be applicable for across the country, that what will be happening across the country as far as the demolitions are concerned. The Supreme Court has made it very, very clear that, a house is not a house, and a house is actually a house of hope for the family members who stay there. You cannot snatch away the fundamental rights of any individual just because he is a convict or he is allegedly involved in any kind of crime whatsoever it is. So Supreme Court has, laid down certain guidelines. The guidelines are yet to be, known to us, because the verdict is still being, read out in the open court, and the verdict once come out in the public domain, we'll get to hear only that what exactly is the guidelines which across the country needs to be implemented. All the civic authorities need to abide by those laws. But what we are gathering from whatever inputs my colleague Anisha Mathur is sending from inside is that the Supreme Court will make it mandatory for all the authorities across the country to send a notice to the house owner, whosoever it is, whether he is involved in any crime or not, or whether he is a normal individual who has violated some kind of municipal law as far as the construction of the house is concerned. They need to inform the particular person whose house is being targeted in advance. The timeline would be, decided by the top court in the particular guidelines. But the Supreme Court has,
just to clarify on one issue here, while they've issued guidelines, inevitably, you see always the authorities saying that this property was illegal and that's why we resorted to demolishing it. What has the Supreme Court in its guidelines spoken about that particular point, about whether a property is deemed illegal or not?
Akshita, the authorities will have to clarify this to the that what is the illegality involved, what is the illegal structure, why are they demolishing the entire property and not the illegal part, why they were sleeping for all these years, because the person gets convicted or gets involved in any kind of crime in that particular state, the action comes thereafter. All these things needs to be clarified to the authorities, because now the guidelines will be in place, and the authorities will have will be a question over as to why they have taken action against that particular property. That particular property could be illegal earlier also, but since the person is now involved in any kind of crime, this kind of bulldozer justice that we usually call, that should be stopped. This is the case is actually come before the top court only because some people from Rajasthan and Uttar Pradesh have approached the top court saying that since these people were involved in some kind of crime, the state government got the bulldozer justice against them, and that is why the Supreme Court was forced to bring out such guidelines to make
You know what's
the authorities
important to highlight
accountable.
here in these guidelines, which essentially means that the state is more accountable, is that in the guidelines, the Supreme Court has very clearly said that there must be a notice, an intimation given to someone before the demolition. What you inevitably see is someone taken, essentially arrested because they're accused of a crime. The very next day, the bulldozer lands up at their property. That can no longer happen. The Supreme Court has made it very clear that there must be a notice issued, intimation on a digital portal in 3 months, where details of the notice, date of displaying notice in public place near the structure, all of that is given. So the Supreme Court is trying to create transparency. They're not saying that, look, bulldozers can't roll, but they're saying there must be cause, there must be reason to do so, and clearly guidelines that the Supreme Court has laid down must be followed. Kanu, what's also important to note here is that the top court has said nothing makes this kind of bulldozer justice okay. They're saying not in the case of an accused, not in the case of a convict, not even in the case of someone who's been given the death sentence.
Yes, Akshita, very right, because the Supreme Court was of the view that, illegality of a house or a structure has nothing to do related to whatever the crime the person is involved. Be it a death penalty case, be it any heinous crime is concerned, it is the court, it is the rule of law that prevails, and the bulldozer justice that we call is not a way to publicly harm the individuals and their family members. Because in the past we have seen that how state governments have cracked down on the properties of those criminals, and that is why Supreme Court had issued strict guidelines to be adhered to by all the state authorities, especially the municipal authorities across the country, as to how they need to take action. Like you have already pointed out, that 3 months time should be given to any individual before the demolition takes place to for any house or something of that sort. So the demolition notice 3 months before will make sure that the person who's willing to demolish that part which is illegal under the municipal laws of that particular state can do so on their own. Because if that is followed, the damage which usually is more when a bulldozer arrives and does on the property, is less when an individual who has violated some kind of municipal law does it on their own. So the Supreme Court has given a 3-month window to all the individuals who have violated some kind of violations as per the municipal laws in their house properties to do so. And the Supreme Court has also made it very, very clear that all the notices and everything needs to be put on a portal also, which will be developed by each state. Now the states will have a huge responsibility to develop that portal and put out all the notices on whose properties they are going to take action in next 3 months, and the notices have been duly issued or not. So everything now, after the Supreme Court guidelines come under the scrutiny of the Supreme Court, the state governments are held more liable for any action that they take from now onward.
But Kanu, correct me if I'm wrong, but essentially the Supreme Court in its verdict has spoken, yes, about guidelines, about how to correct this going forward, but not really about what kind of action should be taken against those who resorted to this previously.
Yes, Akshita, the guidelines will actually, spoken about that, whosoever has, been, has faced this bulldozer justice will have to be compensated. But it depends on case-to-case basis now. What if the houses is completely demolished because of a small illegality involved in that structure? So everything needs to be, measured accordingly. And that is why the Supreme Court has not laid down anything specifically. But yes, a case-to-case basis, if a person has a severe problem in, the house was completely demolished, whereas the violation was a minor one, then that particular person can approach the court against those authorities and seek compensation. The Supreme Court has clearly said that it is not laying down guidelines only on the basis of the compensation, a bracket of compensation that should be given or should not be given, But it depends on case to case basis. But from now on,
okay, Kanu, just stay with me. I'd like to bring in Ghanshyam Tiwari of the Samajwadi Party on this broadcast. Mr. Ghanshyam Tiwari, your view on this verdict that's come in from the Supreme Court, saying very clearly that the state cannot go ahead and arbitrarily resort to this kind of bulldozer justice.
Let me quote to you the Prime Minister of India from the India Today website itself on April 22, when the Prime Minister lauded Yogi Adityanath and he said that the nation should learn from him how bulldozer Raj is done. It is a shame that Supreme Court is now teaching constitution to people like the Prime Minister and Yogi Adityanath, who have been in power for decades, who have been MPs for decades. It is also a shame that Supreme Court teaches Yogi Adityanath's government every other week how to rule by constitution. If it was up to the Supreme Court, these people will be in jail because they violate the constitution, violate the rights of common man, use their dictatorial and torturous methods to snatch away homes of communities and destabilize lives and communities. So it is a tight slap on the dictatorship of Yogi Adityanath, and it is time that Prime Minister Modi and Yogi Adityanath learn the lesson that India is a democracy run by constitution, not by mafia and dictatorship.
The Supreme Court, Mr. Ghanshyam Tiwari, while speaking about this entire case, has also said, has laid out guidelines, including saying that if it's an illegal structure, you can go ahead and demolish, of course, ensuring that you put across an intimation, a notice and whatnot. Now, the Yogi government, as have several other state governments that have resorted to this bulldozer justice model, always maintain that the property is an illegal structure.
They can say what they want. They believe that in their idea of batenge to katenge, they believe minorities are not legal entities in this country. They believe Dalits are not legal entities in this country. When they rammed against the farmers, they believed farmers were not legal entities. The idea of dictatorship is not the idea of India. Supreme Court is teaching this every other week to Modi government and Yogi government.
All right. Mr. Ghanshyam Tiwari, thank you for joining us with your view on this verdict that's come in from the Supreme Court. I'd like to bring in our legal editor, Nalini Sharma, also for more and to really decode what the top court has said. Nalini, very, very scathing comments coming in from the Supreme Court on this kind of bulldozer justice that's become very popular in many, many states. And they've made it very clear with the guidelines laid out that there must be a notice issued prior to anyone. And simply because they're accused of a crime, they're convicted in a crime, that's not reason enough to target their properties.
Well, Akshita, what's interesting is that we've seen several times in the past Supreme Court come forth with this order that houses or properties of any person, even if they're a convict, cannot be demolished. But what's happened today is that the Supreme Court has exercised its special powers under Article 142 of the Constitution that allows the Supreme Court to pass any order to do complete justice in a case. So under Article 142 of the Constitution are these directions that have been issued by the Supreme Court. And let me quickly take you through the guidelines that the Supreme Court has issued today. First of all, the Supreme Court has said that demolition of a property has to be the last resort that must be resorted to. Even when a notice for the demolition has been given, it is important that the owner of the property is given time not only to appear before the authorities and put across his point of view, but he should also be given time to challenge that notice before a court of law in case there is anything wrong in the notice that has been issued by the executive. The court has also gone ahead and said that this amounts to collective punishment. When there is only one person who's accused or convicted of a crime and a house is demolished or a property is demolished, it only doesn't just affect him, it also affects his family members. So this amounts to collective punishment which cannot be allowed under the law, keeping in mind that right to shelter is a fundamental right of all citizens. In fact, the Supreme Court's gone ahead to say that it is really sad to see that women and children are being thrown out of their properties through this arbitrary abuse of process and the abuse of laws that the executive has been doing. The Supreme Court's also gone ahead and said that the notice that has been put or served to an owner for demolition of their properties should be prominently displayed on the properties, and while the demolition is being carried out, there should be a videography of the entire incident, including the officers who were present during this demolition. Why the Supreme Court said this is because in case this was an arbitrary or illegal action or it was done without due process, then those officials need to be held responsible, and they need to be made responsible for restitution of the property, which means that they need to ensure that that property, if illegally demolished, has to be given back to the owner.
Okay, Nalini, just stay with me. I'd like to also bring in Anisha Mathur, who is in the Supreme Court when this hearing was also taking place. Anisha, just explain to us with regards to these guidelines. In the case of an illegal structure being demolished, do these guidelines not then, hold? Do they not have to follow these Supreme Court guidelines?
The court has made a very, very clear order today. Any and all demolitions have to follow these guidelines. Even if a structure is illegal, even if a structure is on, say, a public road or a railway line or a water body, even then the notice has to be given. The court has clearly said that any and all demolitions must follow the process. First of all, to see whether or not the structure is actually unauthorized. Secondly, is there any compounding of that illegality that is possible? Because we've seen in the case of Delhi especially and in several other states, if you, for example, make an extension of a balcony in your house, then you can always demolish just the balcony or you can pay for compounding. So the court has said those aspects must be taken into account. As my colleague was just explaining, any demolition that has to be done, first notice has to go. The notice has to not only go to the owner of the property via registered mail, but also has to be displayed prominently in a place near that particular property. Secondly, that notice has to go also to the district magistrate's office to ensure that there is no illegal backdating of the show cause notices. 15 days must be given to the occupier of the property to either challenge the show cause notice, or if it is possible to compound or remove that illegality, to take the steps to do so. The court has made it very, very clear that bulldozer justice that we've seen in multiple states across the country in the last few years is patently illegal. It is unconstitutional, that no one can be deprived of their house or even commercial property arbitrarily. And we've been...
All right. Let's bring in on this broadcast now Jitu Patwari of the Congress for his view on this. Jitu Patwari, what do you have to say about the Supreme Court's verdict, making it very, very clear that this bulldozer action is unacceptable and is a breach of fundamental rights?
बिल्कुल, सुप्रीम कोर्ट इज ए वेरी गुड डिसीजन. वन थिंग, इससे थोड़ा सा आगे जाके ये करना था कि जिन अधिकारी कर्मचारियों ने ये पॉलिटिकल एजेंडा पूरा करने के लिए जो अनजस्टिस किया, जो संविधान के का तार किया, जो बाबा साहब अम्बेडकर का अपमान किया, उन लोगों से भी पनिशमेंट के रूप में राशि वापस दिलवाई जाए जिनके घर टूटे हैं. और ये मोदी और योगी और मध्य प्रदेश में शिवराज सिंह चौहान का जो एजेंडा बनाकर पॉलिटिकल सुर्खियां बटोरी जा रही थी, उन नेताओं को भी ये करारा तमाचा है सुप्रीम कोर्ट का. और इस देश में बाबा साहब अम्बेडकर के संविधान की रक्षा की सुप्रीम कोर्ट ने हम स्वागत करते हैं. और इससे 2 कदम आगे बढ़ के जैसे इनसे पनिशमेंट के रूप में सैलरी, कर्मचारी अधिकारियों से की सैलरी से इनका एक तरह से कंपनसेशन दिलाना चाहिए.
जी, कॉम्पनसेशन के बारे में सुप्रीम कोर्ट ने यह भी बताया कि अगर इलीगल डेमोलिशन है तो कॉम्पनसेशन होना चाहिए जरूर. लेकिन मध्य प्रदेश में जैसे आप बता रहे थे जितू पटवारी जी, वी हैव सीन अ लॉट ऑफ टॉक अबाउट डेमोलिशंस. लेकिन शिवराज जी हमेशा बताता था कि जो डेमोलिशन हो रहा था वो इसलिए हो रहा था क्योंकि ये इलीगल स्ट्रक्चर है. और सुप्रीम कोर्ट ने बताया कि अगर इलीगल स्ट्रक्चर है तो डेमोलिशन हो सकता है.
No. Illegal structure is only one thing, political agenda completion के लिए. आप ये देखो कि एक समुदाय के लोगों के मकान तोड़े जाना या स्पेशली केवल अनलीगल जो था किसी भी शहर में, क्या वही मकान थे? क्या बात है. ये तो मतलब एक तरह से कुल मिला के पॉलिटिकल एजेंडा, जो भारतीय जनता पार्टी ने नफरत कटोगे तो बटोगे वाली जो थीम है इनकी, उस थीम के प्रोपोगेंडे को सुप्रीम कोर्ट ने करारा तमाचा दिया है. और देश के लोग समझे और देश के लोग सोचे कि सिर्फ ये नफरत से भरे लोग राजनीतिक एजेंडे में ये सब करते हैं जो समाज के लिए घातक है, देश के लिए घातक है.
much, Jitu Patwari, for joining us here on India Today with your view on this big judgment that's coming from the Supreme Court. We've been seeing this kind of bulldozers going ahead and targeting homes, properties of accused in Uttar Pradesh, in Madhya Pradesh, and it was referred to as the bulldozer model of justice. But a question the opposition constantly is asking, Nalini, and if you could throw more light on that, is what action is the Supreme Court actually talking about on those who resorted to this kind of bulldozer action previously? Have they actually spoken about some action that officials will face or authorities will face?
Well, Akshita, interestingly enough, even though the judgment has been pronounced, the Supreme Court has not closed the matter. The Supreme Court has said that it will continue monitoring any acts of bulldozer justice that are carried on across the country, which means that if any citizen is not happy with the kind of action that has been taken by the executive and wishes to challenge whether his house has been demolished or whether only a notice has been issued to him, he can approach the court and challenge the action of the executive, which means that the court will then determine as to whether or not due process was followed, all the guidelines that have been mentioned in this judgment have been followed by the authorities or not before demolishing that particular property. So this means that the executive cannot go ahead and carry out arbitrary actions of demolishing properties of persons. In fact, the Supreme Court also said is that they cannot pick and choose. Suppose there is one area where there are several houses in a row that are part of the public land or on any sort of public property, then only one house being demolished and the other houses being left as it is a pick and choose approach that the executive cannot follow. Either all the houses have to be demolished according to due process or all the houses must be left as it is. So these are some very stringent guidelines that have been put in place by the Supreme Court on how the executive can exercise the action of demolition of the properties, and it's coming as a big relief because anybody who's not happy with the kind of action that has been taken by the executive against them, their families or their properties has the right to now approach the court by virtue of this judgment and say that these guidelines have not been followed during the process and hence the executive should be made responsible. How can the executive be made responsible is another question. Two things that the Supreme Court has said. One, that the executive will be liable for compensation if due process is not followed to that particular person, and second, they will also be liable for restitution of the property, which means it will become the responsibility of the government or any authority that has carried on this demolition to ensure that that property is returned back to the original owner in case due process has not been followed. So keeping this in mind, the case has not been closed by the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court clearly said that it will continue monitoring how the executive exercises its action. The hearing has been listed again after 4 weeks, and it remains to be seen as to whether or not we see a fresh flurry of petitions before the top court of the country by several citizens who have been at the facing end of this abuse of power by the executive.
Okay, I want to bring in Anisha also on this, on the Supreme Court verdict, and just reading through some of the, details that are coming through of the verdict. Anisha, one of the other big highlights of the Supreme Court's judgment is that they made it very clear that these kind of demolitions are simply unacceptable no matter who the victim is here. Whether they're an accused, whether they're a convict, whether they're someone serving a death sentence, it's the onus is on the court to decide the punishment, not on the state.
But clearly, Akshita, this is something that the court has made a very, very pointed statements on. Multiple times this statement has been repeated by the Supreme Court today that you have no right, the executive has no right whatsoever to play judge, jury and executioner. They have said multiple times that just because somebody is accused of a crime, it does not make it correct to demolish their house. They've also said that just even if somebody is convicted of a crime, their property, whether it is residential or commercial, cannot be demolished as a quasi-judicial, as a punishment, because that property may also belong to the members of their family, that property may also belong to other people who live there or work there. It is very clear that a punishment of demolition is not acceptable under Indian law. That is very clearly coming from the Supreme Court, and not just today, but earlier also when the Supreme Court had put a stay order on all demolitions and had very clearly said that you cannot demolish as a punishment. The political use of bulldozer justice that we've seen and what we've seen in the last several months and years is something that the court has come down very heavily on. Just recently, the court had also imposed a penalty on the UP government on this very issue. A different bench of the then CJI D.Y. Chandrachud had done that. And the court is making it very clear that you cannot demolish property just because somebody is accused of a crime or even convicted of a crime. Property can only be demolished if that property itself is an unauthorized structure on a public land which cannot be compounded or otherwise
so the onus is essentially on the authorities to prove that that structure is illegal instead of the other way around. Anisha, Nalini, thank you very much for joining us with all of the details of what's happened in the Supreme Court. Let's cut across to some live updates.
घर से देखता है तो उसको आप इस तरह से बुलडोजर रातों रात ले जाकर तोड़ देंगे तो ये कहीं किसी तरह से इसको कानूनी नहीं माना जा सकता। और ऐसा अगर आप करेंगे तो उस पर कार्रवाई होगी और इवन जो ऑफिसर्स होते हैं उन पर पर्सनल अकाउंटेबिलिटी तय होगी। उसको रेस्टिट्यूशन के लिए पर्सनल पॉकेट से उनको पे करना पड़ेगा। तो ये सारी गाइडलाइंस आज सुप्रीम कोर्ट ने दी है और मुझे लगता है कि इन गाइडलाइंस के बाद जो गैर कानूनी तरीके से एग्जीक्यूटिव्स के जरिए जो बुलडोजर से घरों को तोड़ा जा रहा था उस पर कुछ हद तक लगाम लग जाएगी।
पहले जो क्या बोला
सेपरेशन ऑफ पावर ये कहा है कि देखिए कुछ काम सिर्फ जुडिशरी का होता है, कुछ काम एग्जीक्यूटिव का होता है। अगर आप एक दिन डिसाइड करेंगे कि मैं इसे तोड़ रहा हूं और अगले दिन जाकर तोड़ देंगे तो आपने जुडिशरी को वहां से बाईपास कर दिया। तो जुडिशरी को भी अपने काम करने के लिए एक प्रॉपर टाइम फ्रेम मिलना चाहिए और इस तरह से अगर आप करेंगे तो जुडिशरी को आप बाईपास कर रहे हैं। तो इसलिए वो सेपरेशन ऑफ पावर का जो कॉन्सेप्ट है हमारे यहाँ वो वायलेट हो रहा है। जुडिशरी तक मामले को पहुंचना चाहिए और जुडिशरी उस पर डिसाइड करे कि ये बात जो एग्जीक्यूटिव का फैसला है वो सही है या गलत है।
जिन जगहों पर अभी तक कार्रवाई हुई है उसको उनके लिए कोई मुआवजे या उनके लिए कोई गाइडलाइन बताइए।
जो आज गाइडलाइंस दिए गए हैं उसमें ये है कि जब अगर कोई घर या कोई एस्टेब्लिशमेंट इलीगल तरीके से बनाया हुआ या इंक्रोचमेंट पाया गया तो उस पर पहले अथॉरिटीज उस पर डिसीजन लेंगी कि ये इंक्रोचमेंट है। उस डिसीजन प्रोसेस में इस बात का ध्यान रखा जाएगा कि क्या ये कंपाउंड होकर बगैर तोड़े हुए काम चल सकता है या पार्शियल तरीके से ये इंक्रोचमेंट है या इलीगल है या फिर बगैर इसको कंप्लीट डिमोलिशन के इसमें कोई चारा नहीं है। जब एक ये फैसला ले लेते हैं उसके बाद ये मामला डिस्ट्रिक्ट कलेक्टर के पास जाएगा। कलेक्टर इस पर नोडल ऑफिसर बनाएंगे और वो नोडल ऑफिसर जब बन जाएंगे तो उस पर एक नोटिस जारी किया जाएगा एग्रीव्ड पर्सन को। फिर एग्रीव्ड पर्सन उसको डिफेंड करने के लिए अप्रोप्रिएट अथॉरिटी के पास जाएंगे और जब उस पर फैसला हो जाएगा कि ये टूटना ही है या इसका एक फर्दर एक्शन लेना है उसके बाद उनको 15 दिन का वक्त दिया जाएगा।